Okay. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Howard, and Keep the Faith for the privilege of participating once again in the Latin Mass's terrific conference here in Monterey, one of the most beautiful places in a beautiful country. But this beautiful country of ours is going to endure 4 more years of Barack Hussein Obama.
A little louder, Chris.
And since I don't have a mic, I'm going to have to shout, apparently, and so I'll do that. 4 more years of Barack Hussein Obama. Who knew? Well, I knew. When the Republican Party nominated Mitt Romney, I wrote an article on this, and the title was, "A Mormon? Seriously?" This candidacy of Mitt Romney's shows what a pathetic joke the Republican Party has become. And no one said it better than the columnist Don Feder when he described Mitt Romney's campaign after he lost. Mitt Romney's campaign was jobs, 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 deficits, 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 lose, lose, lose. Now, Don Feder's a Jewish columnist. He can see the problem. That the Republican Party has no life in it, no moral life, no ability to recognize the crisis that we are in the midst of. Our nation is at the precipice of an abyss. We're about to fall into an abyss of corruption without precedent since the Roman Empire collapsed. And all we seem to talk about in the discourse of American politics is jobs, deficits, money, jobs, deficits. Oh, yes, and education. Because education leads to jobs and money. The only one who came close to talking about what really matters is Rick Santorum, and he went down in flames because he dared to suggest that perhaps the divine and natural law has something to do with American politics. Now, during the campaign cycle, and the Democratic National Convention in particular, it was a little film presentation. And during the film, you had one of these folksy American voiceovers, you know, the Wilford Brimley type of voice. And the idea of the folksy narrator is, well, what he says is just plain American wisdom. You have to believe what this folksy guy is saying. And what the folksy guy said during this little film at the Democratic National Convention is, government's the only thing we all belong to. Yes. We're in different churches, different clubs, but we're together as part of our city, of our country, of our state, and our nation. I'm going to explore the implications of that statement in this talk. And then Mitt Romney, during the Republican National Convention, said, and I quote, "We were Mormons and growing up in Michigan." That might have seemed unusual or out of place, but I really don't remember it that way. My friends cared more about what sports teams we followed than what church we went to. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Because what we see in these 2 comments is the state of what the scholars call political modernity. And that means, in terms of political action, the reduction of post-Christian Western man to a simpleton, a 2-dimensional being, the citizen voter, the worker consumer. Jobs, 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 deficits, 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 lose, lose, lose. And the private life of this simpleton, his 3rd dimension, his spiritual and moral existence, he leaves that behind when he exits his home or his chosen temple of worship. And this simpleton of the modern nation state inhabits what a number of Catholic scholars are talking about now in order to clarify this problem. He inhabits what these scholars, including William Cavanaugh and John Milbank, call a simple space. Sounds a little technical, but it really will help you to understand our situation. When you think in terms of America as a simple space, a political space that has been reduced to utter simplicity. And what does that simplicity mean? Cavanaugh tells us, the rise of the modern nation state is marked by the triumph of the universal over the local, and the sovereign state's usurpation of power from the church. The nobility, clans, guilds, and towns The universalization of law and rights would liberate the individual from the whims of local custom, thereby creating a direct relationship or simple space between the sovereign and the individual. It's just me and my government, you and your government. A direct line between the two, nothing in between. And that's what this little folksy narrator meant by the observation that government's the only thing we all belong to. And that's the nub of our nightmarish situation today. The simple space of political modernity is what that narrator is talking about. And this direct relationship in simple space between we, the people, and the federal and state governments that we supposedly created in the American Revolution is exactly, as Kavanaugh writes, the political space imagined by Locke, John Locke, which has two poles, the individual and the state. And Locke called this in his second treatise on government, one body politic under one supreme government. And that's what we're living in now. We're one body politic under one supreme government. And the problem with that one supreme government is what I wrote a book to talk about. Liberty, the God that failed. And I'm going to plug it rather shamelessly and ask you, if you haven't bought a copy, to consider going back after the talk and placing an order for it. Because it provides the entire historical scene in a readable fashion. It's long, but it reads short. It will tell you where this situation began, how we got to where we are today, and how to get out of this situation. Now, the story that what modern man calls liberty tells about itself is a story of an endless epic of peace, prosperity, and domestic tranquility in the spirit of democratic capitalism, to quote the title of Michael Novat's disgraceful book in which he attacks the social teaching of the Catholic Church. And the story that liberty tells about itself speaks of the wars of religion, the terrible strife over religious issues that was overcome by the age of democratic revolution. But as Kavanaugh points out, those so-called wars of religion were actually conflicts that were waged by, and I'm quoting, state-building elites for the purpose of consolidating their power over the church and other rivals. These religious wars in the 16th and 17th centuries were, he writes, the birth pangs of the state, in which the overlapping jurisdictions, allegiances, and customs of the medieval order were flattened and circumscribed into the new creation of the sovereign state, as centralizing power with a monopoly on violence within a defined territory. So the complex space of medieval Christendom, with the church, the clans, the guilds, the towns, all the intermediary bodies, was flattened into a two-dimensional space. You and the government on one plane. And I call that creation flatland. We live in a political flatland. And something fascinating was discovered by a liberal scholar. This may seem a little academic, but I don't think so. I think it's important, very important to look at these things, to understand down in the DNA of our political structures what is going on today. This liberal scholar, in a very important law review article, noted that political modernity, the modern nation state, is the result of a transfer from organic societies, like the one in Christendom, to a synthetic society, a creation. And that creation involves mapping. This is an amazing insight. There's a shift from the status of a subject, I am the subject of King Louis, to a contract between an individual and the government in a synthetic jurisdiction on a map. They draw some borders. They say you're in this synthetic jurisdiction. You're no longer the subject of a king. You're no longer a Catholic living under a Catholic king in a regime whose laws and institutions are ordered by the teachings of the church. No. Now you're a subject living in a defined space drawn on a map, and there's a territorial jurisdiction presided over by a central government. We don't understand this, but this is totally novel in the history of the Western world. And this legal scholar John T. Ford, talks about how the nation-state as we know it today, the kind of government to which we all belong in this flat land, and I'm quoting him, was only possible through the intersection of modern cartography and political liberalism. That is an absolutely stunning insight. What the liberals did when they destroyed Christendom was literally to map out what they wanted as their new territories before they destroyed Christendom, and then applying liberal principles in the age of democratic revolution. They created these predefined territories on maps, and now they rule over these territories with an iron hand. And the role of the church, the role of all intermediary bodies, has been completely privatized within these territorial spaces. And as he concludes, territorial jurisdiction, a government reigning over a square of land, is a foundational technology of political liberalism. Territorial jurisdiction is a foundational technology of political liberalism. If you look at the map of the United States, you see a lot of parallel lines. Everything is neatly arranged. And all of these jurisdictions are carefully mapped out. And if I'm in Pennsylvania and I go over here, I'm in New Jersey. I want to tell you, if you don't understand this today, that is absolutely unprecedented in the history of the Western world. And it facilitates the power of government over us. So you have to keep in mind, when you think about the Electoral College, for example, why the Republicans can't win. We don't have an organic society in which all the people get to decide something together. We have mapped out jurisdictions, and because of the Electoral College, the Republicans are at a fatal disadvantage in almost every election. Because within these mapped out jurisdictions, on the West Coast and the East Coast, the populations of liberals are preponderant, and they win all the big states. The Democrats win the big states before an election begins. So, according to Ford, we ought to see liberalism as a way of drawing the map of the social and political world. He talks about the old pre-liberal map of the Christian world. And then he says that political sovereignty was not territorial in Christendom, but rather in pre-modern Europe, what appear to be territorial communities were in fact groups united by kinship, common interests, and customs. And then he says this, having talked about the role of mapping, cartography, and liberalism. And this is a paradox that is also quite stunning. Liberalism is a world of walls, and each one creates a new liberty. Now, liberals always talk about the unity of man, the brotherhood of man, but the truth of what they're up to is that they have divided the human race in a way never before seen in the history of the Western world. Liberalism is a world of walls, and each one creates a new liberty, but not liberty in the Catholic sense, liberty in the Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment sense. Now, in my book, I talk about a practical example, and this is germane to today, of how this concept of the territorial jurisdiction, mapping out the world, creating borders, dividing people up, has facilitated the triumph of liberalism and the dictatorship of relativism. And that practical example is the Civil War. I spent a good deal of time discussing the Civil War in the book because it is so richly instructive about our current situation. The Civil War is essentially a practical function of liberty. And liberty is essentially freedom from the social influence of the Holy Catholic Church and the destruction of Catholic social order, the overthrow of monarchy, and anything that reeks of what the American revolutionaries called papism, and its replacement by a secular government whose sole source of authority is we the people. Civil war is a practical function of liberty, of a conflict between territorial spaces created by acts of will rather than by the organic existence of peoples over the centuries. The erection of new walls to create a new liberty as needed. So, for example, the liberals of the Montgomery Convention, who founded the Confederacy, hastily threw up a conceptual wall of territorial jurisdiction, snapped to a grid on a map, and they called that the Confederate States of America. While Lincoln and his fellow liberals in Washington resolved to tear down this newly erected wall and restore the previously agreed upon jurisdictional space, the Union, even at the cost of devastating the entire southern half of the Union. Now, without the intersection of modern cartography and political liberalism, there would have been no synthetic states to assert states' rights and secede from the Union. And when a state secedes from the Union, those who engineer the secession claim jurisdiction over everybody within the little square. And if you don't follow what a convention, for example, in Richmond has decided, we're going to secede, now you're a traitor for not leaving the Union. Well, the Union says you're a traitor for leaving it. So in my book I talk about how we have to follow the bouncing sovereign in modern political theory. The sovereign is whatever Tom, Dick, and Harry, or groups of Toms, Dicks, and Harrys, gets together, has a convention, and declares itself a provisional government. And the fact that there's a territorial jurisdiction already mapped out makes it easy for them to say, everybody within these four corners belongs to us now. That could not have happened in Christendom. Could not have had a civil war in Christendom. And had antebellum America, like the Europe of medieval Christendom, been an undifferentiated landmass, as Ford says, with no borders, it's impossible to see how there could have been a civil war. So here we encounter a political reality that affects us today. You hear about the division of powers between the state governments and the federal governments that supposedly was created by the founders and their divinely inspired wisdom. And we're talking about 55 men who met behind closed doors in Philadelphia and literally drafted up a new form of government on paper. The political reality is that the states, as we see in the Civil War, are not really sovereign entities apart from the federal government, but rather funnels of federal power. You will see in the Confederacy that all of the Confederate states lined up behind the Confederate government and did everything the Confederate government wanted. You will see that the Confederate Constitution is a carbon copy of the United States Constitution. There's even a federal supremacy clause in the Confederate Constitution. All they did was split the one gigantic jurisdictional space into two halves, both claiming to be the true heirs of 1776, both of them with identical constitutions, and both of them who had people within them denouncing the tyranny of the central government. The South, as much as the North, had people who were protesting the centralization of power, instantaneously accomplished by conventions of a few people who said, this is the Confederate States of America versus the Union. And so the states were funneling federal power. They were facilitating the Confederate draft. They were forcing people to march and pay, as John Rouse says, pay with their lives to fight for the independence of a Confederate States of America that would, as Vice President Alexander Stephens said, be the controlling power on this continent. It's all about power. And the rise to power of the dictatorship of relativism has been facilitated by this unprecedented way of mapping out the world. And this is what we're living in now. A mapped out flatland of non-organic societies, synthetic jurisdictions. And we have to live with that, because Catholics don't do revolutions. I'm going to talk about non-revolutionary solutions at the end of this talk. But this is our reality. Let us not think this is a traditional setup. In historical terms, it is relatively modern and foreign to the idea of Catholic social order. And that division of the world into mapped out territorial jurisdictions in which subjects have contracts with a government, and there is no organic society, means, of course, the total destruction of Christendom. In Christendom, writes the great German historian Otto von Guericke, the Church served as a model for a parallel system of temporal groups. And these groups all existed together and had their roles in accordance with what Pius XI calls the principle of subsidiary function, or subsidiarity. The Church was a self-governing society. The clans and guilds were self-governing societies. The villages and towns were self-governing societies. They were not responsive to or responsible to a central government or a federal government. And this perennial arrangement of society into organic parts cooperating under the aegis of the Church, under the principle of subsidiarity, that arrangement made for the true liberty of the individual. Because the overriding principle of that entire social structure, and Guericke says this, is that rulers are instituted for the sake of peoples, not peoples for the sake of rulers. Now, the organic society of Christendom, because it was a complex space, represented the true libertarian society, if we want to use that term. I don't like the term, but if you want to be a libertarian, a true libertarian, be a Catholic. Defend the principle of subsidiarity. And recognize that all political authority descends from God to man, not from man upwards. The motto of this country is E pluribus unum, from many one. But the motto of Christendom was the opposite, from one many. From the one God proceeds all of the multifarious aspects of creation, all of the elements of civil order. Everything is informed by the highest good, which is God. And that highest good filters down to every institution and organizes the organic whole. From one, many. In our country, it's from many, one. And the one is not God. The one is the government to which we all belong. And that is our problem. That's the fundamental problem we confront today. And as Gierke says, in medieval times, and I'm quoting, the doctrine of the unconditioned duty of obedience was wholly foreign to the Middle Age. Every duty of obedience was conditioned by the rightfulness of the command, that any individual must obey God rather than any earthly superior appeared as an absolutely indisputable truth. That's the foundation of true liberty. We must obey God rather than men. What do we have now? We must obey men rather than God. If we have opinions about what God teaches and requires, well, those are our private opinions. But in the sacred voting booth, none of that matters. We must obey what men, a majority of men, 50% plus one, have decided. There's a complete inversion of the proper order of political society. The nations have no king but Caesar. And we must obey Caesar in all things. Now, in Christendom, the church, as Leo teaches, and I'm sure you've had some familiarity with his social encyclicals, the church served as the soul of the body politic, the conscience of the state. And there was an organic relationship between state and church. It doesn't mean you had a Vatican transportation system or a Vatican trash collection service or anything of the sort. There was an organic link. The two spheres remained separate, but organically linked, and the church informed the body politic, as it were, like the soul informs the body. And when a state loses its soul, what happens to the state? It dies. We're witnessing the soul death of a nation right now. Make no mistake about it. It's not about jobs, 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 deficits, 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 but rather finding a soul for this nation before it becomes impossible to resuscitate it. Now, the result of the fight between liberals and reactionaries during the age of democratic revolution, reactionaries being us, was a combat, Gierke says. And this is a crucial insight of Gierke's. A combat in which the sovereign state and the sovereign individual, remember those two poles I just mentioned, contended over the delimitation of the provinces assigned to them by natural law. And in the course of that struggle, all intermediate groups were first degraded into the position of the more or less arbitrarily fashioned creatures of positive law, and in the end were obliterated. All the intermediate groups were obliterated, and now we have the sovereign individual fighting with the sovereign state over his rights. And in our elections, it's his rights to money and jobs and education and government benefits, not his right to live in a society where people are not enslaved by structures of sin, as John Paul II called them. Now, the formerly intermediate groups that were abolished in this struggle do continue to exist, but they don't exist in any way that is publicly relevant. They've all been consigned to what scholars call the private voluntary society. They've lost their public relevance. And of course, first and foremost, the Catholic Church, let us face it, has lost its public relevance in this country. Just look at the bishops, and you'll see that that's true. And another intermediate group, the cell of society that has lost its public relevance, is the family, which is under attack by militant homosexualists in every state in the Union. Marriage is no longer seen as oriented to God, the begetting of children, and the conduct of those children toward eternal beatitude. Marriage has lost its divinely ordained relationship, which it had in Christendom of the part to the whole. Everything's related to the whole in Christian social order. And that whole is informed by the highest good, which is God. And marriage has become a contract. The government approves that contract. And so the family is a contractual association, very much like the contractual association a government is supposed to be. And the result is what Philip Rieff, this is a Jewish scholar, in his monumental work, The Therapeutic Age, calls a transitional society. And he says that this transitional society is becoming one vast suburbia, something like the United States, with divided communities of two, perhaps with two junior members caught in the middle of a private and not always civil war. In relation to these intimate, though divided communities of two, the public world is constituted as one vast stranger who appears at inconvenient times and makes demands viewed as purely external and therefore without the power to elicit a genuinely moral response. And with the destruction of the family that we see going on right now, we have what Sir Henry Maine, another non-Catholic commentator, writing in the 19th century, describes as follows. The individual is steadily substituted for the family as the unit of which civil laws take account. This is the aspect of simple space that I'm talking about, individuals and governments. And with that development, society is self-destructing. Its basic cells have been destroyed, so the body is dying. So here we are, citizens of the modern nation-state, a socio-political flatland whose two-dimensional inhabitants, bodies without legally cognizable souls, subsist in a condition of direct subjection to their government. You think this is our government, by the way? That we, the people, have authorized to do whatever it's doing? No. And any potential countervailing authority, especially, above all, first and foremost, always and everywhere, the Catholic Church, has been consigned to the private voluntary society. Now, let's be a little graphic about this. If we live in flatland, a two-dimensional space, and you think of the church as a three-dimensional reality, a transcendent reality that reaches up to heaven and all the way down to earth, what happens when a three-dimensional object attempts to enter a two-dimensional space? If it's a circle, if it's a globe, rather, it becomes a circle. It cannot exist in its tridimensionality in this flatness. It's flattened out. The globe of the Christian commonwealth, of the mystical body of Christ, is flattened into a circle, and it's now at the same level as everything else in the society. And that's why the bishops act the way they do. They're afraid to be the church when they step outside of the edifices that the faithful have paid for. And today, even Catholic churchmen are captives of the spirit of the age. And that's in large measure, I have to say, to the Second Vatican Council's absolutely disastrous opening to the world, which Paul VI lived to regret. He said the opening to the world has become a veritable invasion of the church by worldly thinking. We opened to the world to bring the church to the world. Instead, the world came inside and turned everything upside down, and the Pope himself admits that. And that's why the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, when it was opposing the Health and Human Services mandate on contraception, said this. It's hard to believe that this is how bishops are speaking, but this is what they said. This is not a Catholic issue. This is not a Jewish issue. This is not an Orthodox, Mormon, or Muslim issue. It is an American issue. Well, there we have it. Confirms my thesis completely. The bishops, like everybody else, agree that this entire controversy over the mandate forcing Catholics and Catholic organizations to subsidize contraception will be decided in flatland. In America, the political flatland in which we can only be citizen voters and worker consumers. It's an American issue. Well, no, it's not. It's a Catholic issue. It's a preeminently Catholic issue. It involves the divine and natural law. But being good citizens of flatland, the American bishops consent to the reduction of all social questions, including matters involving the very foundations of the moral order, to a mere contest for votes in the two-dimensional, simple space of the American political arena, in which the members of the Catholic hierarchy agreed to be mere citizen voters just like everyone else. For after all, in the new order of the ages, government is the only thing we all belong to. Now, that's the diagnosis. What about the prescription? How do we escape this absurd predicament before the suicide of the West is completed? Let's talk about some non-starter solutions. States' rights and secession. States' rights is generally advocated under the rubric today of nullification. First of all, the states today are merely subdivided, congruent spaces within the vast, simple space of the United States. And in these territorial jurisdictions called states, you have legalized abortion, subsidized contraception, divorce and remarriage, no-fault divorce, sex ed in the public schools, seminaries of conformity in the public educational system in every single blessed state in the Union. The states are not our refuge. I'm not going to be protected by the state of New Jersey. And you're not going to be protected by the state of California. I think you know that. And what is nullification? Nullification is just another exercise of majority will. We're only going to nullify what the majority would like to nullify. Are they going to nullify abortion? Hardly. Are they going to nullify divorce? Hardly. Are they going to nullify state subsidization of contraception? Hardly. What will they nullify? Gee, let us see. So far they've come up with laws against marijuana use and the real ID law. Woha! Okay, that's not a solution. Nullification is just democracy all over again, exercised within a smaller territorial space, which is going downhill along with the rest of flatland, just like this. How about secession? I have to say that the conservative movement has been taken over by idiots who devise all kinds of time-wasting projects to distract us from the real crisis, which is a moral, social, and spiritual crisis. Their latest asinine waste of time is to call a constitutional convention of the 30 red states to re-ratify our Constitution. Yes, and then what? It will have no legal effect whatsoever, but it will certainly take a lot of time and effort to pull that off. And we'll be left with nothing as the result except a meaningless declaration that we affirm the Constitution as written. And as I show in the book, the Constitution as written, without a Catholic interpretation, and it can be given a Catholic interpretation, the Constitution interpreted according to the principles of those who wrote it has led inevitably on a trajectory from Locke to Obama. There's no way around this. I learned this as I was writing the book, and throughout many of the myths that I had lived with for much of my life. The last attempt at secession, known as the Civil War, cut the jurisdictional space in two. You had two federal sovereigns slaughtering each other by the hundreds of thousands for nothing. And in the book I show how the leadership of the South, after the slaughter was over, said, never mind. I have a section called The Great Never Mind on Robert E. Lee, Alexander Stephens, and Jefferson Davis all saying, well, we lost, now we're all one country again. Let's reunite. Let's not have any more sectional feelings. Don't raise up your children to have any sectional hostilities. We are all one country now. Thank you. Why wasn't that the case before the Civil War? Did 700,000 people have to die to hear never mind? Secession is pointless. It cannot be accomplished except with violence. If the federal government were to say, I grant secession to the state of New Jersey, I would sign that agreement in a minute. But it isn't going to happen. Secession, as Robert E. Lee said, and I show this in the book, is nothing but revolution. Like it or not, the American government is a duly constituted government. Pope Leo teaches emphatically that we must obey in all things except sin duly constituted governments. That is why Catholics served under Julian the Apostate. They marched in his armies. He was a pagan apostate. and yet they obeyed him when his commands were just. Our remedy is civil disobedience to specific commands on grounds of morality, not this nonsensical majoritarian nullification business, where you could if a state abolished abortion, if the federal government rather abolished abortion, a state under the standardless nullification doctrine could reinstitute abortion. No, you need a moral standard for nullification. Nullification plus morality equals civil disobedience. Even the founders recognized that civil disobedience is the remedy for an unjust law. Not this nonsense of creating a Confederate States of America, bombarding Fort Sumter, and all the other nonsense that leads to nothing but useless bloodshed. Now, how do we exercise our right as Catholics, engaging in civil disobedience and other techniques to escape from this prison? The key to the jail, I said it here before and I'll say it again, and it's a theme of my book, is the Word incarnate. Without firing a shot, within the framework of all existing institutions, redimensioned Catholics who will have the courage to be three-dimensional again in public life, in every station of life, can remake this country within 6 months if the bishops led them. All they have to do is open their mouths and lead people. Remember the scene in the movie Braveheart? How many of you have seen that? Where Mel Gibson says to William Wallace, the people would follow you. We would gain our freedom from tyranny. And that was a true tyranny. If only you'll lead them. If only they would lead us, they could remake this country. Protestant ministers won the civil rights movement. They remade the face of the earth, the face of the nation legally, abolishing Jim Crow laws of 1 century standing just by marching in the streets, sitting in the front of buses, boycotts, social activities. And Martin Luther King, ironically enough, spoke of abortion as genocide of the black race. And Martin Luther King, ironically enough, cited St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas in his letter from the Birmingham jail for the proposition that an unjust law is no law at all, and that's why I, Martin Luther King, a hypocrite of course, a plagiarer, an adulterer, but he spoke the truth, that's why Martin Luther King was sitting in that jail cell. He was disobeying an unjust law. What if the bishop said to every Catholic in every diocese, we are going to assemble en masse and march on every abortion clinic in the United States of America and surround them until this evil is ended? What if they did that? Would the federal government send in paratroopers to arrest all the bishops? I don't think so. Would they mow them down in a hail of gunfire? Could they arrest 10,000 people and put them in jail cells for violating the Freedom of Access to Clinics Entrances Act? No. What if they organized an onslaught against abortion on the level of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and told Catholics who to vote for? The Protestants just did that with their Pulpit Sunday. Did you hear about that initiative? Why aren't the bishops doing that? If the bishops told Catholics who to vote for and led a social protest movement in the streets, how long would legalized abortion last? And how long would the Democrats stay in office in state after state after state where Catholics make up a substantial part of the electorate? Let me give you some practical examples of how this works. Nicaragua, only a few years ago, eliminated its liberalized abortion law and completely abolished legal abortion in Nicaragua because Daniel Ortega had a conversion, returned to the church, and led a parliamentary coalition that banned abortion completely in Nicaragua. The new Hungarian Constitution, adopted at the beginning of this year in a formerly communist country that is not even preponderantly Catholic. It's approximately 60% Catholic and 40% Protestant. Here's a constitution adopted only months ago in a modern democratic republic. It begins, "O Lord, blessed be the Hungarian nation." And then it contains an avowal of faith that says, "We are proud that 1,000 years ago our king, St. Stephen, based the Hungarian state on solid foundations and made our country a part of Christian Europe. We acknowledge the role Christianity has played in preserving our nation. Article Q of the Hungarian Constitution makes it clear that what I have just recited to you shall be the basis for interpretation of the Constitution, the Christian foundations of the Hungarian nation. And the Constitution has a coat of arms topped by the Holy Crown of St. Stephen, canonized by Pope Gregory VII in 1038. That's this year. Not 500 years ago. Now, today. In a coalition, I might add, led by Viktor Orban, a Protestant, with Catholics. And the new Constitution passed overwhelmingly in the Hungarian Parliament. And the national avowal of the Hungarian Constitution says this: after the moral defeats of the 20th century, our need for spiritual and intellectual renewal is paramount. That's in their Constitution.
That's great.
In keeping with that aim, Article 2 contains a human life amendment. The pro-life movement in this country has been spinning its wheels endlessly to get a human life amendment. The Hungarians have one. Quote, human dignity shall be inviolable. Everyone shall have the right to life and human dignity. The life of the fetus shall be protected from the moment of conception. That's in the Hungarian Constitution, adopted this year. It also rejects gay marriage. Quote, Hungary shall protect the institution of marriage understood to be the conjugal union of a man and a woman based on their independent consent. Hungary shall also protect the institution of the family, which it recognizes as the basis for survival of the nation. Now, Viktor Orban was challenged about this constitution. The world media, of course, is outraged. The entire empire of liberty is quivering with rage over this development. How could this be in the empire of liberty? A country adopts a Christian constitution just like that? We thought that ghost had been exorcised from the Western world centuries ago. Well, he's under attack. Here's what he said during one interview. Hungary is a Christian country. Christianity is the tide. Hungarians are individualistic and pro-freedom. But freedom is not the property of the liberals. That's the message I've been conveying to you today. True liberty is not the property of liberals. Liberals have given us a world of walls, as I just said a few moments ago. The true liberty is the liberty of the sons of God in the commonwealths of Christendom, which are united throughout the world in the mystical body of Christ. That's freedom. And I mentioned this last year, but I think it's worth mentioning again. The world press was outraged over this, and one comment is particularly amusing. Radio Netherlands frets that with references to God, Christianity, the Holy Crown of Hungary, the fatherland, and traditional family values, critics have slammed the new Constitution as discriminatory. And as I said last year, yes, it's quite discriminatory against Satan. So Hungary did, and I talk about this in my book, what Protestant Americans in the 19th century were pleading with America to do in the 1860s. Talk about a movement called the National Reform Association. I'll only touch on it briefly. But these were very prominent Protestant jurists, academics, theologians, professors of various kinds, eminent people, largely Presbyterian, but other denominations as well. They had massive conventions in places like Cincinnati and Pittsburgh. And the aim of the conventions was to amend the preamble of the Constitution to state as follows. We, the people of the United States, humbly acknowledging Almighty God as the source of all authority and power in civil government, the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler among the nations, His revealed will as the supreme law of the land, in order to constitute a Christian government, etc. Protestants were asking for a declaration in the preamble of the Constitution of what we know as the social kingship of Christ. And of course, Congress turned it down repeatedly. We need only open our mouths to speak that message again, led by the bishops. If we can't get it in the national constitution, we might get it in state constitutions. We might even get it in county ordinances. We might get it in towns. We have to start somewhere. But we need the bishops to lead us in this kind of moral rejuvenation, what we have seen in Nicaragua and Hungary, and what we saw in this movement of Protestants that sadly, sad to say, died out shortly thereafter. Because the Word incarnate has power. Merely to speak the Word is to begin the process of transformation. How many of you have heard of Gianna Jessen, the lady who survived a partial birth abortion? She spoke the Word incarnate to Congress when she testified before Congress in 2000. And here's what she said to a congressional subcommittee. Where is the soul of America? Members of this committee, where is your heart? How can you deal with the issues of this nation without examining her soul? A murderous spirit, and I say it again, a murderous spirit will stop at nothing until it has devoured a nation. Why do you think this whole room trembles when I mention the name Jesus Christ? It is because He is real. He is able to give grace for repentance that we need as Americans. We are proud and boastful, and we kill without shame. Good men have stood before us. They have stood up for righteousness. And today we are nothing but cowards in America. We are under the judgment of God whether or not we want to hear it. I didn't die because I was supposed to be here to say, shame on America. When the bishops begin to speak that way, then things will really happen in this country. So what it comes down to is this. Do we still believe in the power of divine grace to renew the face of the earth? Do we really believe that any longer? Or has our subsistence here in flatland bred it out of us? Do we really have the faith of Christians and the power of the Word incarnate? And in particular, the intercession of the Blessed Virgin Mary, who has transformed more than one nation in the past. Mexico being a very prominent example. Let me tell you about Austria and what Our Lady did in Austria in 1946. This is another practical example of what could happen in this country. Austria was divided into 4 zones in 1946. Russia occupied the eastern zone, including Vienna. In 1946, Father Petrus Pavlicek made a pilgrimage to a Marian shrine in Austria, where he had an interior locution. Do as I say, and there will be peace. The Bishop of Fatima, Portugal, gave him a pilgrim statue of Our Lady, made by the same sculptor who did the original in Fatima. He took that statue from city to city in Austria. He devised a spiritual program that he called the Acts of Reparatory Devotion. Holy Mass, confession, blessing of the sick, and the recitation of the Rosary in public. He called this program Assaults of Prayer. And they sometimes lasted as long as 5 days. Now, predictably, the Archbishop of Vienna declined to participate. But under pressure from the laity, he eventually caved in and joined the crusade. But quite tellingly, Austria's Prime Minister, Leopold Feigl, readily agreed to participate. Not only he, but the members of his cabinet were seen marching in the Rosary processions, holding candles, walking behind Father Pavlicek. And Feigl's successor as Prime Minister, Julius Raab, did the same. And this Rosary Crusade spread throughout Austria and extended even into parts of Germany and Switzerland. By 1955, some 10% of the Austrian population was involved in this crusade, which involved daily prayers to Our Lady of Fatima. And then, on May 15, 1955, the Soviets signed a treaty under which they and the Allied powers would leave Austria. The last Soviet troops left on October 26, 1955. Now, an historian by the name of Siegfried Beer at Columbia University writes this about that development. Quote, the question as to why the Soviets finally decided to abandon their military presence in eastern Austria in the spring of 1955 and to agree to a negotiated withdrawal has preoccupied historians ever since. Don't know why it happened. Well, we know why it happened. Now, apply the Rosary Crusade to America. And please, United States bishops, not another lawsuit. You don't need any more lawsuits. Conduct a Rosary Crusade on that magnitude, 10% of the Catholic population of America, marching in the streets for an end to the evils we complain about so ineffectually. Combine that Rosary Crusade with something like Gene Sharp's 198 methods of nonviolent action. Gene Sharp is a radical liberal revolutionary who perfected the technique of nonviolent resistance to unjust regimes to bring them down without violence or bloodshed of any kind. You want to know one of his key recommendations? Homeschooling. Withdraw your children from the public education system, which is always a seminary of conformity for the regime. Get them out of the public schools. Passive non-resistance of various kinds. What if 25 or 30 million Americans simply refuse to mail in their tax returns? What if? Are we so afraid that no one can organize a movement? To simply say, just say no to the federal income tax. Some people will have to go to jail. But how many can they put in jail? You could bring down the regime bloodlessly in about an hour and a half. We're not sending in your tax return. 50 million non-compliant tax return people. Because in the end, even though political authority does not come from the people, its exercise depends upon popular cooperation. Even a king can't rule if the people won't cooperate with him. He can't execute them all. You don't need to bombard Fort Sumter. Just don't pay your taxes. It's a matter of civil disobedience. So, right now, we have implicitly surrendered to what John Rao calls the grand coalition of the status quo. All of these powerful forces arrayed before us, and we seem to be helpless before them. But we aren't helpless, because we have, with the Church, atomic weapons at our disposal. Weapons that destroy evil while leaving everything standing for good to occupy. There's no need for a change of institutions or frameworks, only a change of hearts and minds. In a sufficient number of people. Doesn't even have to be a majority. Christian political ethics, writes William T. Cavanaugh, is often distorted by treating certain contingent realities as givens. Sin and violence are treated as the way things are, at least for now. The not yet is detemporalized into a constant feature of life on earth. Oh, not yet, so therefore never. The reign of Christ the King has not come to America, so it's never going to come. But exactly the opposite is true. Original goodness, Kavanaugh writes, is more basic than sin. And God opens up a second city, a new kind of imagination that does not treat sin as a given. It is our duty to reconstruct that city in this country to the extent that we can. And I'm harping on the theme, but it is central and indispensable. The bishops must lead the way. And with that, I will conclude by saying what Christopher Dawson said. However secularized our modern civilization may have become, the sacred tradition remains like a river in the desert, and a genuine religious education can still use it to irrigate the thirsty lands and to change the face of the world with the promise of new life. Thank you.